And I want to introduce our speakers today. We have Douglas Johnson from the class of 1992 and Justin Levitt from the class of 2006. And they'll be sharing about redistricting in 2021 and the challenge of fair representation. So thank you both very much for being here, and I will turn it over to Justin.
Okay. Well, thank you for having us, and thank you to everyone who came today. It's a real pleasure to speak to all of you today. As Jenna mentioned, my name is Justin Levitt. I teach I'm an adjunct professor at Cal State Long Beach and vice president of National Demographics, a company that really has its roots in Claremont, McKenna, and really got its start through the Rose Institute at Claremont McKenna College all the way back in the 1970s. And another alum who has worked for NDC for over 20 years now, I know it seems like a lifetime ago, is Dr. Douglas Johnson. I want to give him an introduction as well.
So happy to see everybody. Happy to see some familiar faces popping up here. This is always fun. So thank you, Jenna, and to CMC for the invite. And hopefully this will be an interesting discussion. We're trying to go a little deeper. Assuming you're kind of part of the CMC world, you should have a basic understanding of redistricting, or otherwise Jack Pitney and them have not been doing their jobs. So we'll try to dive in a little more detail to what's going on this time around. So with just as background, as Justin said, I'm from National Demographics and from the Rose Institute. We actually both, I was class of 1992 and have stayed involved with the Institute since coming back to National Demographics in 2001. So getting on 20 years now. So I'm happy to see some of the other Rose folks joining in the participant list here. But with that, I'll jump into our presentation and share my screen. And we'll go through, and we are planning to take hopefully a little under 30 minutes. So we'll have lots of time for discussion and Q&A after we go through these slides. So, of course, any discussion of redistricting, especially coming out of the Rose Institute, we have to include our favorite illustration of the original gerrymander from Massachusetts in the days of then Governor Elbridge Gerry. I would say it's a little sad. He was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, one of the heroes of the Revolution, and his legacy is to be known for the gerrymander. History can be cruel sometimes. But with that, let me click on here. Starting at the basics, of course, first of all, the census, as you've all heard, is about federal financing and about seats in Congress. So this map is the latest predictions of which states will lose seats, the ones in blue, and which states will gain, the ones in different shades of green. Of course, the big shock and the big first time in history moment is California is hoping to only lose one seat. There's actually a decent chance California could lose 2 seats. And hitting close to home, if California does lose a seat, there's a very good chance it will come from the from the San Gabriel Valley region, which we'll talk about in a moment. But nationwide, other than California's oddity, this is kind of the trend that we've always seen, which is the old Rust Belt in New York losing seats, and the Sun Belt and the Northwest gaining seats. And so that trend continues. Texas, of course, continues to be the big winner with everyone going there. Those of you that tuned in for Ken Miller's chat probably heard quite a bit about that and what's driving that, and it continues to be strong. At the Rose Institute, we did do a study looking at within California, where are the areas that are growing quickly and where are the areas that are not growing quickly. We divided the state up into different regions, most of which are or groups of counties. Obviously the San Francisco Bay Area, Central Valley, the basics. And then LA County, the students, for the first time, we were able to really break the numbers down for population estimates within the county into 4 parts. So in this chart, you can see we've got the west side, the San Gabriel Valley, kind of the downtown, what's called the gateway cities area. So really downtown, down to Norwalk, Artesia, Cerritos, that area. And then the San Fernando Valley. So not only is California not growing fast enough to keep all its seats, but most of the state is actually growing even slower than the state as a whole. This bar is the estimated growth in the state. a little short of 9%. And you can see almost all the growth is driven by the San Francisco Bay Area, and then what we call our southern group, essentially all of Southern California except for LA County. So San Bernardino, Riverside, and Imperial, and San Diego. So those two areas have grown, and everyone else is way short. And the reason we talk about California probably losing a seat is because the areas that are way short on population that are close together are the San Gabriel Valley and the downtown Gateway Cities area of LA County. So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. And of course, the usual political dynamics in redistricting don't play in California because we have the whole different dynamics of the independent commission. So we'll see what happens. And of course, you've all heard about the census. The census data was, Justin and I's lives were supposed to get very busy right about now. The census data statutorily has to be out by April 1st. It usually comes out a few days before that, but they're obviously not going to make that. And our lives have been a roller coaster of census announcements for the last few months. First, the Census Bureau said, well, we're going to be late and the data will be out no sooner than July 31st. Then they followed that up with, well, by September 31st. And then a couple weeks ago, they said, well, the data is going to be out by September 31st, but we'll release it early in an old legacy format. They actually called it an archaic format, which hurt me because it's coming out in the data format that I, as a Rose student, learned to work with the data. So I guess they're calling me archaic. But time passes, I suppose. But so now, and then just Monday, kind of breaking news for Californians, California's team that has to work with that population data to put together the state's official data confirmed they can use that mid to late August data release. So California is joining a bunch of other states in adjusting those numbers for prison population. So for the first time, folks in state prisons will be counted at their home address this time around.
And
So what that
Doug,
means, oh yeah.
I hate to interrupt you, but I just want to just clarify. When are we going to know whether California will lose one state or two?
It's a good question. Let me come back to that in just a sec. Let me finish this up here. So we'll have the data for redistricting in late September or early October. And as Justin was just mentioning, the data we use for actual drawing the lines is different than the data that determines the map before this map. We're actually supposed to get the state totals by April 30th. So we'll know if New York's losing one or two, we'll know if California is losing one or two, and who's actually winning a seat by April 30th. But everyone gets their hopes up that says that'll start redistricting, but that is only state totals. The actual data, in California, we have to wait till September, October. Other states that don't do the prison adjustments will likely be able to jump in as soon as that mid to late August data comes out. So depending on where you live, you could be starting a little sooner. I was just reading about Oregon. The state Supreme Court is trying to figure out a new deadline for them. Their constitutional deadline to finish redistricting is July 1st of 2021. And it's hard to redistrict if there's no data yet. So they're negotiating. It looks like they will get a court ordered extension until I think until October. So they'll have just a couple of weeks to do it. And each state is wrestling with this stuff. New Jersey actually just voted to just punt. They're just going to wait until 2023 and hold their 2022 elections in the old seats, assuming that the number of congressional seats doesn't change. So lots going on, and of course, Congress is always the focus in the media. You know, that's what when you hear about redistricting in CNN, it's all about Congress. Of course, the House obviously redistricts, but not the Senate, which is statewide offices. And of course, most of you on this call probably are aware that state legislatures also go through this process. So for example, up in Montana, where currently they only have one congressional seat, so there is no congressional redistricting, they still go through redistricting for their state legislature. Every state, the state legislature has to redraw. And then where we hope you'll get involved, and where we hope if you take anything from this presentation, you take kind of a call to action, is locally. You know, in California, all 58 counties redraw their supervisorial districts. And that's true in almost every state in the country. Now, the big thing in California is so many cities. 10 years ago, there were only about 35 cities in California that had district elections and went through redistricting. There are now about 170. So this is a huge opportunity to get involved in shaping the future of your city council. Lots of school districts, a couple hundred school districts. So if you are involved in your school politics and they elect by what are called trustee areas, you can get involved in drawing those. Water districts, we're working with all kinds of stuff these days. Justin and I are having a little tour through California's forms of local government as we work with the Jurupa Valley Community Services District, the Santa Maria Airport District, the Monterey.
Desert Healthcare.
Which one? Yeah, Desert Healthcare. Yeah, there's a lot of alums of you out in Coachella Valley out there. The Desert Healthcare District that redraws them. So all of these different jurisdictions get involved, and the local level is really where individuals can really make a big impact because so few people pay attention. So if you show up, if you draw maps, if you weigh in on the maps, you can really influence those processes. The exceptions, of course, are those cities that are still at large. So if when your city council comes up for a vote, you're voting for your top 3 choices or anything like that, that's still an at-large system. And they won't be going through redistricting. But overwhelmingly, lots of opportunities where this is happening. We're also in a period of change. I mentioned the California Redistricting Commission. A lot of these local jurisdictions are also going to redistricting commissions. And this is where a lot of the history of the different areas kicks in and runs into the local demographics. So for example, in LA County, historically, we've had for decades 3 congressional districts that elected Black or African-American representatives. The 37th, kind of around Culver City and into towards downtown, the Inglewood, Gardena, 43rd, and then the Southgate, Linwood, Compton, 44th district. 10 years ago, if you followed the process, this was the debate. Should they continue to have 3 seats or make it just 2? There would be more safely or more heavily Black or African-American, and make the 3rd one a more Latino seat. If you were following 10 years ago, this led to probably the most famous tweet of the whole process, where one observer tweeted out, "There's no crying in redistricting," taking a line from Tom Hanks. And because there were actual, this got so emotional that 2 of the commissioners were in tears during the debate, debating over trying to preserve this history versus reflect the new demographics. And of course, they kept the 3. They follow tradition, but the demographics are kind of, irresistible. And so mid-decade, the 44th district elected a Latina, Representative Berrigan. So now the new commission will likely redraw these seats completely. Who knows what they'll do, if they'll try to preserve a 3rd seat as one that a Black or African-American candidate would have a good shot at, or if they'll just accept the change in demographics, make the 37th and 43rd more strongly Black or African-American, and move 44th to be more of a Latino seat. All these questions are open, and you can obviously see they make a huge impact in representation for the year to come, or for the decade.
Especially because this is the region that's likely to lose a congressional district too.
Exactly right. Yep, the seats will kind of all have to shift likely towards the San Gabriel Valley as they absorb that population from the seat that collapses. So we'll see. And the other dynamic here is that the 47th district down here in Long Beach, for those of you in the area, that seat is half LA County and half Orange County. So those seats tend to be the ones that can compress or move because they're weird of crossing county lines. So we'll see what happens. And the one thing we really, again, coming back to local redistricting, the big change is at the local level. LA County is going to be a giant, massive mess of a battle. The districts you're looking at a map of the current 5 supervisorial districts. These are, other than the California Board of Equalization, which is just weird, these are the 5 largest single member districts in the country. Each board of supervisor member represents 2 million people, and has massive power over tons of spending and policies in their own district. And the map has looked more or less like this for 30 years. Well, now we have a redistricting commission coming in. The supervisors no longer control their own map. And this map is likely to be blown up. Latinos are pushing for a second seat. Asian Americans are pushing for a stronger Asian American seat. Black or African Americans want to preserve their historic seat. The gay community on the west side has an openly gay supervisor. They're interested in preserving a seat that has a good chance of continuing that. And then this weird seat of Diamond Bar wrapping around to Manhattan Beach, which has always been kind of the leftover seat. Who knows what will happen with that, but it's obviously a very strange seat. So lots of pressure, lots of change to come, and no one really has any idea how it will play out. But obviously, as an independent commission, they'll be looking for people and groups to get involved. So way more opportunity to influence the process this time around than anywhere else. And this is true in San Diego, in San Mateo, and San Bernardino, all of which are having their first commission redistricting processes. And of course, at the city level, you can see the numbers on the right here. We've got, pre-2006, there were only 29 cities in California out of 482 that were by district. And now we're going up to 171 of the 482. Justin and I wrote a paper calling this a quiet tsunami sweeping across the California local government territory. Just as one example, here's some charts we put together. On the left is Orange County in 2010. The light yellow cities were all at large. Santa Ana and Newport Beach have this odd, you have to live in a district, but the election's still citywide. And Seal Beach was the only city in the whole county that had by-district elections. Now on the right, you can see all the bright green cities have switched. In the course of the decade, by-district elections just swept through the county, and you can see how many of them are now by district. Even Santa Ana, which had that hybrid system, has gone to just pure districts. So, and more to come. We don't expect there to be anywhere near as many at-large jurisdictions 10 years from now as there are now in Orange County. And this is not unusual. We could do a map like this in just about every part of the state. So if you didn't follow your city 10 years ago, they probably didn't go through the process, and now they will. And we would encourage you to get involved. So with that, I'll hand it over to Justin to pick up the next slide.
Thank you, Doug. And it's really, all of this is really taking place in light of a new law passed last year, AB 840, was 849? Or 849, that changed the rules for how counties and cities have to redistrict. And so one of the new things that we're going to be seeing this year is that in addition to those federal requirements that have continued, districts have to have the same number of people in each of the in each district. There's also the Federal Voting Rights Act and Section 2, which the Supreme Court did not throw out, still applies to cities and counties as they look at their district lines, as well as other Supreme Court provisions that prevent racial gerrymandering or race being used as the predominant factor in districting. Now, cities and counties have to follow an rank-ordered list of criteria as they try to figure out how to draw districts. So, for example, they now define what a contiguous district is. Those of you may be familiar with this term, and the concept has always been that, well, all parts of a district should touch or should be whole. But now they've kind of defined certain kinds of contiguity, like if there's a ferry line, that is the priority for contiguity to an island. So for a city like Avalon on San Clemente on Catalina Island, now there's a much clearer motivation for how that must be linked to Long Beach in the congressional or supervisorial district. On the other hand, a lot of these are going to result in we're still trying to figure out what exactly some of these will look like in practice. So the second criteria, for example, keep neighborhoods together and keep communities of interest or areas of a similar socioeconomic status that should be kept together for better representation, as the law says. What exactly does that entail? And we're going to be talking about that here in a bit, but I want us to think about some of these. Normally, we've talked about balancing all of these criteria. And if you've participated in districting in the past or looked at the state's criteria for other, if you were involved in the past, a lot of these like communities of interest, compactness, identifiable boundaries were criteria that had to be looked at simultaneously or together. And it was up to the board or the community to make a decision about how these criteria should be interpreted for that area. Now, this rank ordered list might mean that, well, we have to prioritize keeping this subdivision intact, even if residents in that neighborhood don't necessarily want to be kept together. Or that this kind of a district that connects two very similar communities, but has to go around a third community that looks different, might not be acceptable under this new definition of compactness. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how these new criteria play out over the course of this districting cycle. In addition, there's a very explicit ban in the Fair Maps Act on consideration of political party. So you can't, which honestly, for most local governments in California, as nonpartisan entities, they didn't really look at party in the first place. But now there's a very explicit ban on taking that into account, at least directly. And I'm sure that you'll still see interest groups coming with maps that are designed to favor candidates who are members of a political party. And certainly third parties and you as members of the community can look at that yourself. But the moment you start to bring it up, that no longer can be taken into account because of the explicit prohibition on it. Also, the other part about the Fair Maps Act is, what about the criteria that it doesn't mention? And so on the right-hand column here, under other traditional districting principles, we have several points or several criteria or potential criteria that courts have recognized as being legitimate districting principles, such as respecting the voters' choices. We think about this as the incumbency provision. It's one that MALDEF and the NAACP even endorsed in their guide to redistricting. If a community has a representative that's serving them well, then that should be taken into account when looking at how lines are drawn. But that's not explicitly mentioned one way or the other in the Fair Maps Act. And so how do we take into account other traditional principles recognized by the courts in this new rank ordered system under the law? And I think this is going to be one of those things that makes districting very interesting this year. How are cities and counties going to prioritize them? It's very clear they have to be after all the other criteria that are rank ordered, but to what degree can they still be taken into account? Now I want to say a little bit more on communities of interest, because over the past 30 years, communities of interest have really become the center point of discussions on redistricting. And I think a lot of us, I know at CMC, Professor Heslop had us look at Reno versus Shaw, which was a 1993 landmark case where Sandra Day O'Connor used this term, communities of interest. And although she wasn't the first to use the term, it really is kind of the case that transformed communities of interest into something that was taken seriously as a districting idea. And unfortunately, she doesn't define it in the court case, but there are ways that groups or lawyers have tried to define it over the years. And it's more of a sort of general set of principles, areas that have shared concerns, problems, perhaps overlapping legal boundaries. So areas that send kids to the same school, or in a larger city, maybe the part of the city that's in a single school district. Those of you might be familiar with neighborhoods, whether it's a homeowners association or apartment complex or retirement community. Officially recognized regions, an old town or a planning area, an economic development zone. Those of us who get really into the weeds on the census data often are using socioeconomic data to look at communities of interest. Where do we see concentrations of renters or of families with children at home? Where do we see concentrations of high income earners, for example? And then of course, above all, testimony. What do people in the community say their communities are? One great example of this was the LA Times mapping project. What they did was they asked residents to give their perspective on where the boundaries between different neighborhoods were. And sometimes they ended up producing very similar maps to the official Los Angeles city planning areas. Other times their regions were quite different. And in particular, one of the things in the LA planning area does is a lot of commercial districts are actually in more than one region. But residents will often see certain roads or major streets in particular, like in the San Fernando Valley, as the dividing line between communities, where the planning agency tends to look at that commercial corridor as, part of a single planning area. And so residents will often disagree on where these communities of interest are. And then that's part of the challenge of districting, organizing and getting your community together to present why this is an area that needs to be kept intact. Why don't we go into the next slide, Doug? And as we're saying, this could be as simple as, here we have an example from Arizona, where a portion of a county feared that their interests would be subsumed by a larger, more populous portion of the county, and asked the State Redistricting Commission to separate them and make sure that their region, the Verde Valley region, was in a separate legislative district than the city of Prescott itself. So even though Yavapai County, which is what we're looking at here, is actually about the size of a legislative district, it's divided to divide the Verde Valley away from the Prescott area in order to take these communities, that particular community concern, into account. And that's one of the challenges here, because you would, on one hand, have people from Prescott saying, no, it might be better to keep Yavapai County together as one single community. And on the other hand, you'll have people from Camp Verde or Sedona saying, no, we need a separate legislative district for our region, because otherwise we'll be forgotten by a representative that lives in Prescott. And, this also varies by level of government too. And this is something to really think about a lot if you're getting involved. A community of interest that exists for a city may not exist the same way for the school district. One very common one are business improvement districts. A lot of cities try to keep those business improvement districts together in one district because they need a council member who's kind of the one that they can go to. On the other hand, schools will look at business districts and say, nobody lives there, great place to put a line. And the concerns can really vary depending on which level of government, where you're districting. And this brings us right to the heart of what I think we all think about with redistricting, which is how communities can be divided. And I remember learning this back in Gov 20 at CMC, where we talked about packing and cracking are the two most traditional forms of gerrymandering. In cracking, what we're doing is we're taking one of those communities, sometimes racial community, but it doesn't have to be. It could be a city. Stockton, for example, was divided in 2001 into 4 state assembly districts. Why? They each had a finger into the city coming from different directions. And what they had done, and what that's called when we break up a neighborhood like that, is called cracking. On the other hand, packing is overrepresenting a particular group within a specific district. So for example, out in Arizona, they proposed a state legislative district that put all 3 Sun City communities into one district. So basically, it would be dominated by residents from those retirement communities, and all the other voters in that district would be outvoted no matter what. But on the other hand, you'd have so many retirement community members that in effect, they would be underrepresented, because they could, if they were broken up into two separate districts, they'd be able to have an influence in two and have a, if not a majority, at least a good number of voters in both. And this is not just the case in California. I know you Stockton. I see Candy mentioned Austin, which was similarly divided by the 2010 or 2011 legislative maps or congressional maps in Texas. There's some really interesting cases where cities are divided for racial reasons. I'm thinking of Miami in Florida, which has a number of strips running through the city designed to intentionally separate African-American neighborhoods, Cuban neighborhoods, and white neighborhoods in the city. And so for voting rights reasons, they actually do divide the city into multiple parts to take those voters into account. And as we go on, I think we're going to see an example of that in a couple of slides. But before we get there, I just want to say that, and all of this really matters. I remember I'm class of 2006. When I graduated, when I went to work up in Sacramento right afterwards, I was told over and over again, California is just not a competitive state anymore. The reason we're not seeing parties change legislative district, it's not going back and forth between parties, is because California is just not competitive. There's safe Republican areas and safe Democratic areas, and that's it. And one of the things we really saw in the 1990s, and actually if we put up the 2010s, they would look a whole lot more like the 1990s, is that redistricting and where you draw the lines can determine how easy it is for a party to win and to switch or flip party seats. Not a single congressional district in Orange County switched party hands the entire decade from 2002 through the 2010 election. On the other hand, we've had 7 party shifts in Orange County since 2010, since the new lines. We had one year where there were 4 seats in Orange County that flipped, and the next year 2 seats flipped back, just in the last 2 elections. So how you draw the lines, and no matter how much a particular neighborhood might be overwhelmingly one party, where you put the lines can shape whether or not you do have competitive districts, whether the parties have to compete in order to win. And those regions, of course, are going to change as national trends go back and forth. But the point is, you can find competitive seats if you draw your lines right. And just to kind of wrap this up, to go back to that, communities of interest theme that we've been developing on the next slide, Doug, I just want to highlight one example of what we're saying about representation. This district in Arizona used to get brought up all the time as the example of one of the worst gerrymanders in the whole country. And for those of us who knew what we were looking at here, it was like, no, this is intentional. Because what we're doing here is we have 2 Native American reservations, the Hopi and the Navajo. And the Navajo reservation almost completely surrounds the Hopi reservation. But for federal representation purposes, the Hopi and the Navajo requested different congressional representatives to help represent them. And so that's what these 2 districts in northern Arizona are doing. The Hopi reservation has been taken out from that district in order to make sure that their representative doesn't also have that conflict where they're also representing the Navajo as well, for better representation. And I think Doug was involved in that back in 2001. So he wants to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, and it was a fascinating fight as the 2 groups differed. And this is exactly going to Justin's earlier point, where they decided the 2 tribes had different interests at congressional level, because that's where tribal rules and tribal funding come from. But legislatively on state issues, issues, they really did not have that much of a separate community of interest. And so in the legislative map, the two tribes are drawn together, and you don't get this neck here is the Grand Canyon. So the Hopi tribe is connected to the Colorado River section by the Grand Canyon. I will go from there and just wrap up a little bit. One thing to keep in mind when you do get involved is watch your deadlines, because different types of jurisdictions have different deadlines and they vary widely from state to state. But we'll be rolling in, and some of these, as you see at the bottom, California's fire protection districts have buried in the fire code a redistricting deadline of November 1st, which of course will be very hard for them to meet given the data is so delayed. And that date may be coming out. The legislatures are looking at these archaic provisions of the statutes and trying to fix them across the whole country. There is a ton of information out there. I'll send this PowerPoint over to Jenna, and anyone interested can contact the alumni office for it. Much of this is Rose Institute. You can see in the top right our giant Claremont College's digital library, which has a ton of Rose Institute materials. And I'll leave you with one piece of trivia before we get to Q&A, which is, as those who come out of the Rose Institute know, it is gerrymandering. Those that followed the Wisconsin and other cases about partisan gerrymandering, the US Supreme Court kind of punted on all that and said, we're not going to rule on all these issues. We'll leave that to the states. But they did actually, in response to a letter from the descendants of Elbridge Gerry, the administrative office did acknowledge that it is Gary, not Jerry, and the court, they advised the justices to refer to it appropriately. So a little bit of trivia there for you that Elbridge Gerry was pronounced Gary, so we do call it gerrymandering. But with that, I will turn off my screen sharing and we'll go to some Q&A. And obviously we're happy to talk in more detail about any of these things or how you can be involved as we get to Q&A.
Thank you so much. This is really informative. I encourage anyone to use the raise hand feature if you'd like to ask your question directly. Otherwise, I can start going through some of the questions submitted through the chat or private message. Okay, I'll keep my eyes peeled for those raised hands. One of the questions from the chat comes from Allison and is asked, it'd be interesting to learn what the process is for the representative who loses their role, and also what is driving the increase in population to the southern part of California?
So I'll take the first part of that. It's actually interesting. A little known fact is that members of Congress have to live in their state, but not in their district. So you get some odd things happening where the member who loses their district will obviously end up in somebody else's district. And historically, what usually happens is they run against whoever seat they end up in, but they don't have to. Those of you down in San Diego have seen some members of Congress move from district to district over the last couple decades. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. And that happens across the whole country. The other piece is that members often take this opportunity to retire. You know, our wonderful alum David Dreyer did exactly that when they tried to get rid of him in two efforts, and he outwitted them and ran and won in those. And then after 2000, he finally just retired. And so that took the pressure off the other members when he did that. And that often happens as well. And Justin, do you want to address the demographics?
Yeah, on the second piece, what we're seeing is that LA is mostly built out, especially in the sort of the basin part of the city. And so what we're seeing is that the development in Southern California is coming in the Inland Empire. It's in San Diego County. It's infill development in some of the more built up areas, but even places like Upland. I mean, I remember when I was in Upland 20 years ago, there were a whole lot of brownfields or even just gaps between different communities. And those are being filled in. You know, Upland and Montclair, for example, have added something like 4,000 new people through apartment units that they've built along like Monte Vista Boulevard just in the last 10 years. And so that's really what's going on. There's room to build in the rest of Southern California. And so, I think San Diego is actually on track, if it hasn't already, to surpass Orange County in population, because it simply has more room to grow.
And I would just add that the shocking fact to come out from the last two census estimates, the annual estimate that the Census Bureau puts out, which are both pre-COVID, are that LA County actually lost population in 2018 and 2019. So it's not just slow growth, it actually lost population. And this is all, as Justin said, there's no housing being built relative to what's needed. And for decades, California has lost population to other states with internals, and we made it up with immigration. A lot of it from Mexico and Latin America, but also a ton of it from Asia. And both of those sources have largely dried up in the last 10 years. So California is still losing tons of people within the US to other states and not getting the immigration to backfill that we used to.
Thank you. Jack, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
I would. Thanks so much, Jenna. And thank you, Justin and Douglas, as well, for this really interesting conversation. I'm a campaign staffer myself, and I've been focused a lot on local politics. So I was really curious about the conversation about the kind of tsunami that we're seeing of transitioning from at-large districts and at-large seats to district-specific seats. And I just wanted to see what you attribute that transition to, if anything in particular, and if I have seen it nationally, and if we think that that will continue nationally as well.
Yeah, it's in California, it's the California Voting Rights Act, the law that passed in 2002. And, it's been a huge tool for MALDEF and ACLU and the traditional voting rights groups to bring district elections to cities that needed them. In Merced, when we went to work for Merced, they got a letter from a lawyer from MALDEF saying, switch or we'll sue you. And they had recently had a zoning issue that, Merced's a pretty big city, but they couldn't vote on the zoning issue because 4 of the council members lived within 500 feet of the parcel in question. And so they had to recuse themselves. And as soon as they got the letter, the city council immediately said, yes, this is an issue. And they now have district elections, council members from all over the city, a very diverse council. So that's a very handy tool for those groups. It's also being used, this is California. It's being used and abused. So similar to what we see with SECRA rules and Americans with Disabilities, there are other lawyers, not the voting rights lawyers, but other lawyers who are just, as we call it, carpet bombing letters. So in 1 week, all the cities in Riverside County will get a letter. And so, this being California, litigation is so expensive that everyone is just switching just about. If anyone's from Santa Monica is fighting this. If they end up losing, and their case should be heard at the state Supreme Court in just a couple months. If they lose, the plaintiffs have asked for $22 million in legal fees. And that will probably go up to 25 or 30 by the time that case is done. So a few cities have the money to fight it. So that's why it's sweeping California. But I think the good examples of where this has brought more representation for groups that are historically not represented is also spreading. Washington State now has their own state Voting Rights Act, and hopefully they're finding ways to rein in the abuses while still empowering the groups.
And it's important to note the role that the Federal Voting Rights Act has played in this in the broader sense. When this movement actually started back in the 1970s, when a lot of Western cities started growing to the point where their at-large councils no longer represented a city that now had 1 million people, and a lot of those early lawsuits were brought under the Federal Voting Rights Act. And it was kind of, especially here in California, when that Federal Voting Rights Act kind of reached its limit, that the California Voting Rights Act was proposed and really came in to make it easier to encourage that transition.
Yeah. And it is changing elections. And the sad thing we're seeing is that when MALDEF and those groups come in, they're working with the local neighbors, the local activists, and so they get districts drawn and people run for those seats. The problem with the kind of carpet bombing letters is that many of them don't even have a local plaintiff. And so in those jurisdictions, we're seeing a lot of uncontested elections. So it's we're seeing a real dichotomy in the impact of going to districts in where it's a grassroots movement versus the impact where it's just problem.
And Candy mentions cumulative voting here, and I want to point that out because regionally we're seeing very different approaches. And cumulative voting is very common and very popular in the South, but it's almost unheard of in the West. And so there's been a lot of these cases where you've seen regionally adapted versions of voting rights laws, because what works in California doesn't work in New York. In New York, all local elections are partisan. And so all of our laws about nonpartisanship just don't work in a state where they still elect their dog catchers by party, and different regions, different solutions for different regions, different states even.
Great, thank you. We had a question in the chat come in from Jonathan talking about how artificial intelligence will soon do any and all redistricting, saying it can already do tasks such as this, many orders of magnitude more efficient than any commission or legislature. We need to quickly move tasks that AI is better at to free up humans for tasks that humans are more superior. Would you like to comment on your thoughts on that? Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Not really a question, but a statement.
Yeah, we've been hearing about this for 30 years, that the computers are coming and will solve everything. So far, the computers are just making the people in control very, very powerful and drawing the lines. You saw those numbers Justin talked about in 2001. If you let me write the algorithm, I will love AI. The challenge we're seeing is that AI is really just algorithms written by people at this point. And to give you a great example of where it blows up and why it doesn't work is in Orange County. There's Little Saigon, and Little Saigon is a very heavily Vietnamese community that crosses. It has pieces of 3 different cities. So when you write your AI algorithm, do you keep the city together and thus divide Little Saigon, or do you keep Little Saigon together and divide up the cities? Those are the kind of choices that the computers just can't make. And we've seen this in a lot of litigation. There are academics now that have written programs that generate 10,000 maps, and then they show you the partisan breakdowns of those 10,000 maps. Well, they've got some huge assumptions in there. The most common one says, is a city bet united, that's great, or is it divided? Well, what ends up happening is, like what Justin was talking about, the algorithm doesn't care how many times it's divided. So the moment a city gets divided once, the algorithm will divide it 50 times. Well, that's a different issue. So the computer tools are getting interesting for evaluating maps after the fact, but there's still nowhere there for drawing maps, except with very simple criteria like compactness. But again, compactness is a tough one because compactness breaks down on mountains. You end up with both sides of a mountain being in the same seat. It looks great, but it's a 400-mile drive to get around the mountain from one side of the district to the other. So far AI is not delivering anything, but who knows what the future will hold. This is still too much of a what do the people in the community think process.
Thank you. We had someone ask, what is the process in becoming a member of the commission?
It varies from place to place. So a lot of them have very elaborate application and interview processes. Most of the commissions have already formed, and so they've all been through this. And some other places, they're political appointees, so it can vary a lot. Michigan took a very interesting approach of just apply, and then we'll draw a bunch of names out of a hat. So that was a creative one. So in the locals, what we're seeing locally in cities and that is generally they're a general tendency towards retired judges doing the picking. And so there's a pool of retired judges in California that have made known that they are willing to serve this role, and a whole bunch of cities turn and draw out of that pool for retired judges to evaluate the applications. But it is a very tough process. A friend of mine applied for the state, and then when he didn't get that, he actually was they made a pool of 60 and he was the 61st person. And And then he applied for LA County and didn't get that. And both of them involve a lot of writing, a lot of essays, public comment, public debate on your application, and then interviews. But it does vary a lot from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So definitely check out your local city and what they're doing, because that's where we're seeing commissions still forming. Anything to add to that, Justin?
No, I think just a lot that a lot of them do have diversity requirements that the commission needs to mirror in partisanship or in race or ethnicity, the composition of the district or of the jurisdiction. And so we often see that even if the commission is got lots of applicants, there may be gaps in who's applying to be on the commission.
Great, thank you. Another question from the chat. When it comes to considering race in redistricting, I saw a note on the slide about the Fair Maps Act that federal laws prohibit racial gerrymandering. However, it seems like race may be a factor in determining communities of interest for redistricting purposes. Can you help explain what is or is not acceptable and how that plays out in your experience?
Okay, go ahead, Justin.
Yeah, so the way that the courts have in Supreme Court, and this is the US Supreme Court here, has interpreted the Federal Voting Rights Act is that race cannot be the only or even the predominant factor in the composition of a district. Now, the way that the Supreme Court writes about communities of interest implies that race and communities of interest are two distinct concepts. I would say from what we hear in the community, race or ethnicity is often something that comes up as part of the communities of interest discussion from residents. But we have to be very careful, as you know, this is part of our job as redistricting consultants, to try to hear what other factors besides that simple race or ethnic label bring that community together. And oftentimes it's not that hard. Oftentimes what you see is there's other similarities in that community that really make it a very distinctive neighborhood. Sometimes it's as simple as, you know, this area has a lot of immigrants and other parts of the city don't. Other times it involves a number of different factors, everything from how recently people have moved into the city and what schools they go to and what parks they have their kids play in, you know, and all of those other factors are legitimate concerns recognized by the courts as going into communities of interest. So we have to be very careful at how we talk about it. And it doesn't even get into the complexities of some of the racial categories. So we often talk about Asian Americans as one distinct group in terms of voting rights, but that could not be further from the truth in many Asian neighborhoods, where you'll talk to a Chinese community in Garden Grove and they're saying, no, we're not the same as the Vietnamese in Westminster. Or even that, you know, the Chinese community in one neighborhood is not like the Chinese community in another neighborhood in the same city. And that has come up in redistricting and the process. And really that's part of what that community testimony is about. And trying to really understand those nuances in order to create, you know, to bring those communities of interest to the picture and go beyond just the simple, you know, racial numbers. You can't create good representative lines just by looking at those racial statistics.
And it varies a lot from place to place. You know, different parts of the state and of the country have more of a tendency to vote along ethnic or racial lines than other areas do. So, you know, and different citizenship patterns too. You know, we see this a lot. In some communities, the Latinos will be just as large a share of the electorate as they are of the total population, because it's a long established, you know, community where the Latino community is just as middle class as everyone else is. In other areas, you get new arrivals. Justin and I did a fascinating project down in El Cajon, where they have essentially a Middle Eastern refugee population that has sprung up from zero to tens of thousands in about 15 years. And it's a very interesting process of which neighborhoods are the first arrivals who are now citizens and fully engaged in the community, and which neighborhoods are the, you know, the Syrians who arrived last, who, you know, are just learning English and are far from being citizens. So all those kinds of factors come into that decision. And we really see this a lot when MALDEF or the ACLU or voting rights groups show up. They show up with 80 pages of data and documents showing it's not just the color of the skin that ties this community together. It's education levels, it's language isolations, all this other stuff, so that it does clearly make that line of, yes, race is a factor, but we're not doing this purely based on color of skin. It's all these things are tied into that.
And I just have to toss in that Southern California is at the forefront of this, particularly in neighborhoods like the San Gabriel Valley and in South LA. You're just seeing very different patterns than the typical white-black pattern we're familiar with from, Southern voting rights in the 1960s.
Thank you. All right, in an interest of time, this will be the last question, so I apologize to anyone who I didn't get to your question. So there's a question in the chat asking, is there any chance that the district that Darrell Issa currently holds may become more competitive?
Hi, Gwen. I know that was your question. It's going to be very interesting because all of the Southern California districts, all of the San Diego area districts are likely to have significant change, other than perhaps the Latino district down along the border. But I think the San Diego area was one of those areas that was, I won't say an afterthought, but I know a lot of the local politicians were not happy with the congressional lines in the county that the commission drew last time. And I was living down there at the time. I remember a lot of that discussion. And so I think that the San Diego lines are very likely to change significantly this time around.
And in particular, if California loses a second seat, the second seat that kind of collapses is likely to be in the Orange County, San Diego County area. So that would really scramble them even beyond what.
Yeah,
what
maybe it's ICE's old seat, the Levin district. That would be interesting.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. Well, Jenna said, leave them wanting more if we can. So we'll wrap it up, right?
Yes, thank you all. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to our hosts. If you'd like to unmute and say goodbye, now would be the time. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.